I have written a book on this subject recently, which was a couple of 100 pages long. So if I were to repeat my answers to these questions from the book, it would take a long time. But the fundamental, I think, point is that right now, no country can exercise effective global hegemony. And that was the issue during the 20th century. There were 3 huge wars fought, 2 of them militarily and 1 politically, throughout the century. And the outcome of each war would have been global hegemony by someone, and indeed in 2 of them, that was a direct result, with enormous destruction in the process. Today, the world is much more diversified, and it's much more difficult to develop effective international cooperation in an era of instability and uncertainty. Well, first of all, the United States is still the most important country in the world, the leading country in the world, and the chances are that it will remain so for X number of years. I'm not going to predict, because it depends in part also on what happens to other countries, notably China. I think the American role is to try to promote international solutions to increasingly ominous global problems which are not only political and social, but also ecological, which are fundamentally human problems. So it's a huge undertaking, and the United States has to be responsible, engaged, and at the same time aware of the fact that it cannot dictate. It depends on the extent of international cooperation. The more there is international cooperation, the greater the possibilities for less dominant, less powerful states to play an active and constructive role. Well, it's like saying in general, what role do children have in the management of houses? You know, it's just common sense answer. Power, which means not only military power, but economic power, wealth, resources, technological innovation, all of these are factors that dictate how much relative power different states have. The region is obviously in a very vulnerable part of the world. It's a relatively unstable part of the world, and a part of the world in which there are many ongoing crises, with the risk that these crises could come together and create a major explosion in world affairs. And that's why everyone is watching so carefully what is happening in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, in Syria, in Iran, and in the Caucasus. Normalizing relations with another state is a two-way process. I don't think Georgia can on its own normalize relations with Russia. Russia also has to seek, to want, to desire normal relations with Georgia. Now, obviously, there is an enormous disproportion in power between these two states. But even so, given the fact that we live in an international system in which sovereignty is to some extent an equalizer, the desire for normal relations has to be a two-way street, not just a one-way street. I don't know. History is not like a tape recorder. You can play it back, then reset it, and have something else appear in its place. History is what happened. And I know that there are many disputes on this subject. But in any case, the outcome was one-sided, clearly. Somebody lost something, and somebody occupied something. But whether that war could have been avoided is impossible for me to say. Well, I don't know how accurate that assertion is. I have not carefully examined that particular issue. But obviously, if a country wishes itself to be sovereign in reality, and not just in terms of a legal principle, it has to have some effective control over its important national assets. Well, I think you're asking two different questions. Georgia is close to Russia. Look at the map. At least that's my impression from looking at the map, that Georgia is close to Russia. Will Georgia be a member of NATO? If it qualifies to be a member of NATO, it can be a member of NATO. But do bear in mind that NATO has rather explicit standards for membership. one of which is constitutional democracy and respect for the rule of law. And that's a very important criterion. And if Georgia becomes dominated by political retributions, then of course its capacity to qualify for membership in NATO will decrease. I think that Putin reflects a phase of nostalgia in some sectors of the Russian elite and of the Russian public. Nostalgia for imperial status, for domination over its immediate neighbors. It is a nostalgia which is unrealistic in the long run. But in the short run, obviously, it helps him to consolidate power and to use nationalistic appeals in order to make that power more extensive and more solid. In the long run, however, I think more and more Russians, particularly younger members of the new middle class, realize that there is no future for Russia if Russia itself does not move closer to the West. And moving closer to the West means becoming increasingly a real democracy, and not merely one that proclaims itself to be a democracy. Well, that is a fact of life. A very important shared economic enterprise is, in a sense, what defines their relationship. The Baku-Ceyhan pipeline is something of enormous strategic importance, but also of great economic benefit. I think if these states have close relationships, if they influence each other, if they encourage each other to respect the rule of law, democratic principles, avoiding of political or personal retributions, whenever there is a political change in the country, they're going to have, I think, more collective influence. Well, first of all, I think the initiative involves primarily the United States and the European Union, not individual states. Now, if Georgia were to move closer to the European Union, obviously, it would be influenced by the outcome. But I would say that the idea in general is, in my judgment, historically important and potentially very significant in a strategic sense as well, and not just economic, because it would have the effect of creating a transatlantic bloc that is politically as well as strategically integrated. And that, of course, would give the West far greater influence in this very rapidly changing world. Well, I can't predict how successful it's going to be. I have no way of knowing, and I don't think anyone else knows how successful it will be. I think what you are referring to is a mutual interest in having the International Olympics be successful, not be interrupted by some massively tragic events. But that does not define the very complex relationship that exists between the United States and Russia. And one hopes that as closer discussions between America and Russia unfold, the cooperation will become larger, and some of Russia's strange moves lately against democracy, against societies in Russia that favor democracy, that favor close contacts with similar societies in the West, will be reconsidered by the Russian side, because a drift away from democracy is not going to be helpful to a closer relationship between America and Russia. In general, I would say that political respectability is Georgia's greatest asset. And Georgia in recent years has been a democracy, not a perfect one. Every democracy makes mistakes. But I think it would be very sad if internal politics in Georgia became increasingly similar to, let us say, the internal politics of Ukraine under Yanukovych, where personal retribution is an important aspect of political life, or like Lukashenko in Belarus. I don't think that has happened. I don't think it is yet happening, but there are some indications that it could be happening. And if it does happen, it will simply mean that Georgia will be more isolated and therefore more vulnerable and therefore at greater risk.